The town of Silver Hollow sat quietly nestled in the protective shadow of the Colorado Highlands. It was the kind of place where life moved at a slow, easy pace. Here, neighbors greeted each other with a wave from their porches, and doors were left unlocked as a sign of trust. The rhythm of life followed the seasons slow, steady, and peaceful, with only the occasional interruption when nature decided to change the tempo. But that calm, predictable flow of life was shattered 3 years ago. It happened with the spring flood that came earlier and stronger than anyone had prepared for. Rain poured relentlessly into the valley for days, soaking the earth and melting the last remnants of snow high in the mountain passes. The river, swollen and wild, overflowed its banks. The land beneath it gave way, crumbling, and the valley was swallowed by grief, as if it too had lost something precious. Ethan Bennett, the calm, steady local forest ranger everyone knew and trusted, was lost to the flood. He had been rescuing a stranded hiker, braving the rushing waters when he was swept away. His body was never found. His daughter, Leia, was just 5 years old at the time. She had always been a quiet, observant little girl, often found sitting with her sketchbook, drawing the world around her. But after Ethan's death, something changed in her. She stopped speaking, not because she couldn't, but because something inside her had broken. It wasn't stubborn silence. It was a deeper kind of silence, a survival instinct, like her mind and soul had shut down to protect her from the overwhelming loss. Rachel Bennett, Ethan's wife, was left to carry the weight of both her grief and the burden of motherhood. A wildlife behaviorist by training, she left her research at the university behind and moved with Leia to a small, quiet cabin on the edge of the national forest. It was a place where Ethan had once thrived, and where Rachel had spent countless years studying the creatures of the forest. She hoped that the peacefulness of nature might heal Leia's heart, that the stillness of the woods might offer the solace and therapy that had eluded them both. But the silence that filled their home now was different. It wasn't the calm, peaceful hush of the forest that Rachel had once loved. It was heavy, hollow, a constant, aching reminder of everything that had been lost. Rachel worked part-time with the local conservation bureau, doing field surveys and camera trap analysis, but most of her time was spent with Leia, hoping, waiting, and watching. Leia, for her part, still drew. She wandered through the forest, her movements silent and graceful, but she never spoke. And deep in the woods, something watched her back. One night, in the dead of darkness, the storm came. At first, it was just a long, steady rain that soaked the earth and thickened the air. The trees seemed to whisper, as if they were hiding something, holding on to secrets they didn't want to share. Rachel had gone to bed early, lulled to sleep by the soft rhythm of the rain drumming on the roof. But down the hall, in her room, Leia sat wide awake, her eyes fixed on the window. She heard it again, a faint, broken sound, a high-pitched whine. It was barely a sound at all, more like a cry for help. Something out there was in trouble. Leia's heart tightened. Without thinking, she slipped from her bed, her small feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She moved through the house like a shadow, silent and precise. She grabbed her red raincoat, instinctively reached for her sketchbook, and slipped out the front door, determined not to be stopped by anyone or anything. The creek near the trail had turned wild from the recent thaw, its waters rising fast and swallowing the stepping stones that Leia knew so well. The water churned violently, crashing and twisting like it was alive. The cries grew louder, more frantic, more urgent. Then Leia saw it. A small, soaked German Shepherd puppy, stranded on a shrinking patch of mud in the middle of the storm's violent torrent. Its fur was plastered to its trembling body, and its legs buckled as it whimpered, helpless in the darkness. Leia froze. Her breath caught in her throat. For a split second, her mind went blank, but then, in a flash, something surfaced, an image. A feeling, not a memory exactly, but something close. She had never seen it before, but over the years, her mind had filled in the blanks. The rushing water, the howling wind, the desperate cries, and her father's face, arms outstretched, disappearing into the flood. It wasn't a memory she could recall from life. It had only existed in her drawings and her dreams. But it felt so real, so vivid, that it haunted her even now. That same fear, that same paralyzing terror, gripped her heart. Her legs locked, her body frozen in place. The current raged wildly before her, and the puppy cried out once more. Her heart raced, uncertain and terrified. But then something shifted inside her. It wasn't a voice nor a thought, but a deeper, quieter feeling of warmth, a pulse in her chest that wasn't her own. It wasn't just a feeling of fear or doubt. It was a calm that settled over her, urging her to act. Be brave. Save him. Leia, it wasn't spoken, but it echoed note outside, but somewhere within she blinked, straightened, stepped back, kicked off her boots with a splash, and walked straight into the water. The creek bit at her ankles, climbed to her knees, dragged at her coat. Still she moved forward, one step, another, her raincoat balloon adorned her. A stone shifted underfoot, she stumbled, but didn't stop when the water reached her chest. She swam. She wasn't strong, but she was steady. The Tinyas land collapsed just as she reached Iden. She lunged forward, arms out, her fingers curled into the soaked scruff off puppy's neck, pulling him close. Hadn't resist. He knew she had come for him. Together they turned toward the shore and froze, standing at the edge. Off bank were 7 full-grown German Shepherds, silent, unmoving eyes, glinting amber in the rain. They didn't growl, didn't bark. They simply stood, watching, not blocking her path out of malice, but guarding it with purpose. Rain was still falling when Sheriff Marcus Doyle turned his headlights onto the forest trail the creek had overflown earlier that evening, and he'd been driving slow through Theback roads, checking for flood damage. He wasn't expecting anything more than a few fallen limbs, maybe a stray deer. Waith saw instead, stopped, his breath cold. A girl in a red raincoat stood near Theffer bank of the swollen creek, soaked tough bone, clutching something in her arms. Puppy limp but breathing, and around her, like sentinels summoned from the woods, stood 7 large German Shepherds, forming a wide arc between her and the trees. They didn't move, not when his tires crunched gravel, not when his door cracked open, not even when his boots hit mud. He didn't reach for his weapon, somehow he knew not to. The girl didn't look afraid, she didn't speak either. She just stood, their eyes wide, one hand resting protectively on the little doge in her arms. One of the adult shepherds stepped forward, not aggressively, slow, deliberate. Its ears twitched, rain dripped from its thick coat. Then just a few feet from Leia, it stopped and lowered its head, not in fear, not in submission. The movement was quiet, careful, almost hesitant, and somehow it felt intentional. It was as if the dog understood something unspoken, as if it had seen the little girl step into the flood when no one else would, as if this simple silent gesture was the only way it knew how to say, I saw what you died and I trust you. Leia didn't move, she didn't even blink. She stood there, soaked and trembling, holding the tiny pup close to her chest, and for a moment There was no rain, no creak, no fear, just a chilled and a creature, two quiet hearts recognizing each other. The pack behind parted. Slowly giving her a path, Sheriff Doyle exhaled and stepped forward. He extended a hand, not to grab, just to for Leia didn't take it, but she walked toward him. The puppy pressed to her chest, the dogs following behind like acquiescent honor guard. No words were exchanged. No one needed to speak. The storm did all the talking. They got home just before dawn. Rachel had been frantic when she opened the door to see Sheriff Doyle carrying a muddy, silent Illa in his arms, her red raincoat soaked and clinging to her skin, nestled against her chest, almost hidden beneath her chin, waist tiny German Shepherd pup. His eyes blinked sleepily as if the storm hadn't happened at all. Rachel didn't speak. She only nodded, arms open, as Sheriff transferred her daughter into. Later that morning, after warm baths and dry clothes, Leia sat curled on the living room rug beside the fire. The puppy, whom she had already named Ash, lay sprawled across her lap, belly up, twitching in a dream. Rackle made tea, unsure if she should speak. Dr. Eleanor Graves, the child therapist who had been working with them for nearly 2 years, arrived not long after sunrise. Rachel led her to the evening table, where a small stack of drawings lay, neatly arranged, drawings Leia had made long before last night. 1B1. Dr. Graves flipped through them, her eyebrows furrowed. "These aren't new," Rachel said softly. They were tucked under her bed. Each page was filled with precise, quiet observations. A black and tan shepherd standing watching near a tree stump that the inside of a rocky overhang, shadowed but dry, a trail winding along the north ridge marked with claw prints. "She's been watching them," Graves whispered for a long time. Rackle looked toward the living room. Leela hadn't spoken, but something inside of her had started to shift, like a frozen river beginning to crack under Springson. Outside in the early light, 7 shapes stood at the edge of the trineslin, unmoving. They didn't bark, they didn't approach, they were just there, waiting. By the end of the week, the story had already spread. People talked in hushed voices at the diner, the grocery clerk whispered to the mail carrier at the hardware store. Someone swore they saw the dogs themselves lined up like soldiers just watching. And then the first sheep went missing. A rancher on south end of town found 2 lambs dead, another gone entirely. No tracks, heckled follow, no signs of struggle, just silence and blood in the grass. 2 nights later, it happened again, this to Meadow. Caleb Turner, one of the most respected cattlemen in Silver Hollow, hadn't hesitated. "These aren't pets," Caleb said at the emergency town meeting, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "They're wild, dangerous, organized. If we act now, it'll be a child next." Rachel sat at the back of the community hall. Illa's hand curled tightly in hers. Didn't speak yet, but her eyes were sharp, darting nervously from face to face, reading every line of fear, every flicker of anger. The words bounced off the wooden walls like warnings, wild, dangerous, a threat. Each one seemed told on Illa's shoulders like stones. Her grip on Rachel's hand tightened. She had seen how the pack moved, how they watched it. They bowed. They weren't monsters, they were her friends. And now these people, these adults, wanted to hurt them. Her throat ached with something shackled and say, but her eyes burned. Sheriff Doyle stood at the front, arms crossed. Hell, looked tired. "We don't have proof," Hesed. "They haven't harmed a person, and I was there that night. What I saw didn't look like aggression, but Caleb wouldn't budge. Intentions mean nothing when your Levestock's torn to pieces." A vote wascled. Half the room raised their hands for removal. A smaller number, Rachel Sheriff, a few quiet allies voted. Todd lay outside as the crowd filtered into the street. Rachel turned to Doyle. "If they move forward with this, I can't stop them," he said, "but I'll buy you time." The house was quiet that night, too. Quiet. Trackle sat at the kitchen table, her tone touch, staring at nothing. Ash was asleep on the rug, tail twitching in a dream, and Leia hadn't said a word since the meeting. Not that that was unusual, but tonight her silence felt heavier, not withdrawn, not lost, just focused. She sat on the living room floor, legs folded, sketchbook in her lap, a pencil moved steadily in her hand. No hesitation, no wasted lines ratched from the hallway, afraid to interrupt. When the drawing was done, Leia slid the paper forward, a map, detailed, deliberate, stunningly accurate. Fennerthorn Ridge, the dry creek bed, a narrow gap between two boulders, trails that weren't on any public record. She's been there, Rachel whispered. The next morning, Rachel placed the map on FedEx in front of Dr. Graves and Sheriff Doyle. She drew this last night from memory, and every trail matches what we found on the old Ranger maps. Doyle raised an eyebrow. You sure she's never been taken that deep into the woods? Not with me, but look at this. Rachel pointed to a small mark, half shaded, a rock overhang with a tree split down the middle. That's real. I saw it once. Drew Graves ran her fingers along the penciling. She's not imagining it, she's remembering. Doyle sat back. And you think this is where they live? Rachel nodded. Or at least where they go to feel safe. There was a pause. Then we need to get to them first, Doyle said before Caleb dozed. Rachel hesitated, then turned to Leia. Will you take us there? Leela didn't speak. She simply picked up the map, stood and walked to the door. She had already decided. The next morning broke with sky the color of slate. Rachel packed Asmal bag, first aid kit, water, spare cloths for Leia, while Sheriff Doyle checked his radio and scanned few other reports. The forecast showed clear skies, but his gut said otherwise. It'd be mid-morning. The three of them were hiking north, following the map Leia had drawn with eerie precision. She walked ahead of them, not speaking, but moving with quiet confidence. Her steps never faltered. She paused now and then, not to think, but to listen, and each time she adjusted course ever so slightly, like Simeon, who understood the forest in ways others didn't. It was nearly noon when they saw them, 7 German shepherds lying low in a shallow ravine near a cluster of rock ash, now running freely beside. Leia yipped once and bounded down toward the others. The pack didn't flinch. They rose slowly, one by one, their eyes calm, steady, locked on Layla. She raised a hand, not a command, just a greeting. The alpha stepped forward, touched noses with ashen, turned its gaze to the humans behind her. It didn't growl, didn't run. Rachel whispered, they trust her. Sheriff Doyle nodded. Let's move. But just as they began leading the pack toward a safer ridge farther north, a sharp crack echoed through the trees. A gunshot. Get down, Doyle shouted. Caleb Turner's voice rang out from above. They're here, don't let them scatter. Men emerged from the trees, rifles raised, faces hard. The dogs froze. Rachel shielded Leia, pulling her close, but Leia broke free. No, she cried, her voice raw, shaking but real. She sprinted toward FedEx just as Ash darted into the tree. She followed instinctively, feet pounding the wet earth. A moment later, the ground gave way beneath her. The scream tore from her throat as she slipped down a steep incline, tumbling through brush and stone, landing hard on a narrow ledge. Shouldn't move from above. The pack began to howl, not in fear, but in warning. Ash appeared first, skidding to her side, licking her cheek, nudging her gently. 1v1, the rest of the pack came into view, forming a protective ring around her broken, silent body, and they waited. Rescue team arrived just before sunset. Leela was conscious, but barely a gash above. Her brow bled steadily, and her ankle was clearly broken. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she just clutched Ash to her chest and stared up at Thefrest, canopy, eyes glassy. The ledge was narrow. It took careful maneuvering, ropes and 2 medics to lift her safely back up the ridge. Rachel ran to her daughter the moment her boots hit the soil. I'm her, she whispered, tears already spilling down her face. You're okay, Caleb Turner stood a few feet away, rifle still slung over his shoulder, face unreadably big. What he had just seen, that girl chasing after the pack, throwing her sulfito danger to protect them, was not something he could ignore. He looked past Rachel to where the 7 dogs stood just beyond the clearing. They hadn't runthy, hadn't bared teeth. They just watched, not like predators, like sentinels. Then softly, so soft, Rachel thought, she imagined it, Leia's lips moved. They'll come back. She whispered, her voice scratchy. From disuse, they promised. Everyone around her went still. Rachel dropped to her knees, her hand on Leia's cheek. Say that again. Leia blinked, her face pale but clear. They promised. And just like fate, after 3 years of silence, the world opened up again. Caleb lowered his head, exhaling. Slowly, I was wrong, he said, about them, about her. He turned to Rachel, his voice low. Rachel nodded, her fist with relief beside her. Leia closed her eyes, ash curled against her side, and in the distance the pack fatted silently into the tree's spring. Came again to Silver Hollow, this time slower. Kinder the snow melted without violence. If river kept its shape, the ski stayed calm. Nature, it seemed, had remembered how to breathe. So had Laiash spoke now, not much and not loudly, but when she did, her words carried weight. At school she had made 2 close friends. She still didn't like crowds, but she laughed sometimes, and when she did, Rachel would stop what she was doing just to listen. Ash, now fully grown, rarely left her side. He walked her to school each morning and waited patiently until the final bell rang. No leash, no commands. Just trust in the pack. They had returned slowly, cautiously, never close, never far. Every so often Rachel would spot one in the trees at dusk, half shadowed, but still watching. Waiting not for food or shelter for her. Rachel had begun a research initiative, this time with Caleb Turner's full cooperation. He helped build observation posts near Thewwoods. Together they documented pack behavior, how they traveled, how they instead how they protected. One Anothercalub never spoke much during their sessions, but he listened closely, and sometimes he smiled. One evening, as twilight settled over their home, Rachel passed by Isla's room and paused. Her daughter sat by the window sketching with charcoal. The page showed the pack drawn in perfect stillness, and beside them stood a figure. A man in ranger boots, flannel shirt, his face turned slightly to the side. What stood out weren't the details, but the eyes. They were her father's. Rachel's breath caught. Who's that? She asked softly. Leia looked up. She didn't smile, she didn't cry. She just said, he walks with them. Reckle didn't need more, not science, not proof. Just the knowing, deep and silent, that maybe love doesn't disappear, maybe it finds new footsteps and walks quietly beside those we leave behind.